This is Michael Luchies with After School, and this is the Social Change with Technology interview series. Today, I am joined by Diego Mariscal, CEO and Chief Disabled Person at Together-International.org. Diego, tell us about your work in Together International.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Very excited to be here. I guess first of all, I should start with my own story. I was born in the States. I was born in New Orleans, actually, but I was raised my entire life in Mexico. And I was raised in Mexico, having been born with cerebral palsy, which is a disability that most people develop at birth. And the reason that I developed it was because I was born 6 months and a half into my mom's pregnancy. So apparently I was pretty stubborn even before I was born. And so I was very frustrated about the fact that, throughout my education and throughout my development in Mexico, I wasn't exposed to other people with disabilities. I was always the only one who self-identified as disabled and who looked visibly disabled. And I went to private schools in Mexico. And so we started a series of workshops that was all about educating students about disability and getting to talk to them about disability. And within a few years, those workshops went nationwide. We went from one high school to 5 to 15. And so really, when I moved back to the States, we said it's really important to continue that work that we're doing to educate young people about disability, but also, I think more importantly, to empower and connect other young disabled people to themselves. Hence the idea of Together, of unity, because the reality is we're the largest minority in the world, and yet most people with disabilities feel alone. And so there was a really clear problem of community that we need to solve.
Why do they feel alone, and what can we do to solve that?
Yeah, good question. I think there's a lot of stigma surrounding disability. When you look at different minority groups, like the women's group, the African American group, the Latino community, even now the LGBT community, there's a level of pride and identity in those communities, and I think for people with disabilities that hasn't been the case. Oftentimes when you talk about disability, you talk about it from two different angles, either from a tragedy and something horrible that went wrong, or from a very sort of inspirational, motivational perspective, which some people say, oh, well, that must be a good thing, but the reality is you're putting people with disabilities on a pedestal that is unrealistic. And so, being able to have conversations about sex, about education, about different political views, about feuds with parents, about, frustrations on a first date, like those real issues, I think a lot of spaces don't necessarily promote.
What are the most common misconceptions about people with disabilities?
Yeah, so kind of what I mentioned before, I think there's two sort of main misconceptions that I've went through this. I've gone through this my entire life. One misconception is that we're very inspirational and that sort of we're just kind of angels that have fallen out of heaven. And I literally probably like once a week will get stopped on the street by a random person just for walking the way I do, and somebody will tell me, oh, you're such an inspiration. Thank you for thank you for living your life. And this person doesn't even know me. They don't know anything about me. And so that's, one piece of it, really looking at our lives as sort of inspirational beings that don't go through the similar frustrations and experiences that somebody without a disability goes. And then the other extreme of that is that a disability is the same thing as a tragedy, right? And like we're suffering and our lives are so hard and difficult. And they kind of go hand in hand, right? Because disability, in most of people's minds, disability is so difficult, therefore somebody who's living with a disability, you know, and quote unquote overcoming their disability must be inspirational, right? And I think that's just not true. Disability is a part of human diversity, just like race, gender, sexuality, and so while those characteristics obviously have different struggles and different facets to them, so does disability, but it's not necessarily a tragedy or an inspiration in and of itself.
How can today's technology help those with disabilities?
I think technology plays a huge role in people with disabilities because it allows us to connect with one another. It allows us to you know, live our lives in a more independent way. I have a friend who says technology improves the lives of people without disabilities, but technology allows people with disabilities to live their life. And the reality is that it's true, and everything can be a piece of technology. I mean, you know, I use a wheelchair, I use a motorized wheelchair, that's a piece of technology. You know, when we connect with people via Facebook, we're using technology to connect with one another and to tell our stories. You know, this conversation that we're having over the phone is a piece of technology. And so technology really allows us to live our lives outside of our physical body, right? And so it can really enhance and connect people with disabilities to opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting what you said about the most common misconceptions. Are there other stress points? Are there other, well, I'm sure the answer is yes, but maybe you could help us if there are people that want to make sure they're not offending people with any type of disability. What are some of the things that they should avoid or look out for in their own behavior towards others?
I think the easiest thing, and I get asked this question a lot, you know, what's the role of non-disabled people in this movement, right? And the role of non-disabled people in this movement is just to empower people with disabilities and also to ensure that disability is part of the conversation. I mean, I am very frustrated about the fact that there is multiple organizations that serve the disability community that are led by non-disabled people. If we had an organization, a women's-focused organization that was led by men, people would be really confused. And somehow that doesn't apply to disability. And so I think the role of non-disabled people and everyone in general is to be really critical and saying, you know, my role as a non-disabled person is really to support people with disabilities. What does that mean? That means that I need to let them speak, to hear their voices, to hear what their concerns are, and I just need to kind of step out of the way and support people the right way. So that's a very, you know, easy thing to do. Even like parents sometimes will be very overprotective of their children, sort of dressing them however they think that they want to be dressed. Or if they're going out on a date, the parents will suggest a time and a place. Or if they're, you know, if they don't want to hang out with a particular individual, the parents will say yes. You know, all those things. So being very deliberate in sort of allowing people with disabilities themselves to lead their own lives, I think it's the most important part. And then, you know, if you don't have necessarily interaction with somebody with a disability, just being conscious that a disability is another part of human diversity, and so bringing disability into the conversation and into the discussion, I think is really important as well. Because you never know who has an invisible disability, right? And so if you bring disability as part of the conversation and the discussion, you might be surprised how many people quote unquote come out as disabled because you've opened the space.
Where does today's technology go wrong, or in what ways does it not do enough to help?
Ooh, I like that question. I think where technology goes wrong is most people believe that technology is sort of the solution to inclusion, right? We think that, oh yeah, with technology we're going to be able to include people with disabilities, but the reality is that inclusion goes beyond just access. There's a stigma surrounding disability. So to give you an example, I have CP, I walk, and I would play soccer for a few years when I was younger, and I was pretty bad. And and my classmates didn't like to play with me because I was pretty bad, and I refused to use a wheelchair. And the reason that I refused to use a wheelchair was because of the stigma that I had associated with a wheelchair. A wheelchair is a piece of technology, and yet I didn't want to use it because I felt like sitting in a wheelchair was going to make me somehow less than somebody who walked. And so, that's just an example of my own stigma surrounding the disability, my own stigma surrounding technology. And so, technology in and of itself is not enough. It's about breaking the stereotypes that surround disability, and technology can be a tool to do that.
That's great. And switching to social media, what can social media platforms do better to give all users, including those with disabilities, an ideal experience?
Well, I mean, there's a level of compliance, right? Federal law requires, I think it's 508 compliance. So that is sort of the basic web accessibility, right? That you would hope, all social media platforms oblige by. So that's a good start. But the other thing I would say is don't just limit yourself to people because the 508 is mostly for people who are blind and hard of hearing, to make sure that screen readers and other pieces of technology can be utilized. But there are other things like forums or like making sure that in your terms of use you are explicitly saying that you're committed to disability inclusion. Making sure that your brand or your community knows that people with disabilities are welcome and listened to. Again, because it goes back to the stigma, right? If nobody talks about disability, if disability is sort of this hidden topic, people aren't going to feel comfortable expressing what they need. I was in a group a couple months ago, and I always talk about disability. I always bring it up. And so I had been going for months to this group, and I again talked about disability, and everyone in the group started coming out expressing that they had a particular disability, whether it be depression or anxiety or whatever, right? And so you're not going to know what your community needs in terms of technology and platform if you don't, if you're not intentional about making sure that people with disabilities feel comfortable and have spaces to express their needs.
And how can we get that conversation on a greater scale? And what else can we do to help transform that stigma?
I mean, I think this is a great start, right? Making sure, making sure that disability is an integral part of all the work that you do. For example, in this series of conversations, obviously including a person with a disability, I don't know much about the after-school app, with the features within it or the community posts within it. Maybe doing a section of what are the most frustrating myths about, or the most frustrating experience about disability for students, or misconceptions about disability. For Do Something, which I know what you guys partner with, are there campaigns that are talking about disability? It's just a matter of how do we integrate disability into what we're already doing. It doesn't necessarily mean creating a new program or a new space. It just means how are we integrating disability into what we're already doing.
So for people that haven't had exposure to what the stigma can do, are there other examples that you can give, or any way that you can make it real for them of how important it is to get rid of that stigma?
Well, I mean, just looking at the facts, right? Looking at the fact that people with disabilities are the largest minority in the world, yet we don't talk about it. I mean, when was the last time you saw? This year was a phenomenal year because it was the first time I think ABC is doing a mainstream show about a person with a disability that actually has a disability. If you look at the media, people with disabilities are always played by non-disabled people, and are always, and it's always, again, this tragic or inspirational story behind it, right? And so looking at the media, looking at, even right now with the political climate that's going on, I'm just going to go out and say it, like Trump was mocking a person with a disability, right? And like, how does that affect, how government thinks about disability, how society thinks about disability? And so just being very aware of most people, when I tell them people with disabilities are the largest minority in the world, 1 billion people with disabilities live, they're shocked. They can't believe it. I mean, that's 1 out of 7 people. And so, the struggle is real. We just have to be cognizant about bringing conversations to the table.
Now, one of your primary focuses with Together International is to teach young people about disability. How do you do that, and what's most important for them to know?
Yeah, good question. So we, similarly to Do Something, we do campaigns around disability, and it's all about empowering people with disabilities to produce some sort of social change related to disability. So, for example, right now we're doing a campaign around disability and entrepreneurship called Disability Startup, and it's all about how do we make entrepreneurship spaces more accessible for people with disabilities. And so young people with disabilities get a chance to go through a program and sort of start their own business, and also look at existing programs and say, how is this accessible or inaccessible to me, and rate different programs that way. We did a campaign a couple of months ago around education and making sure that students learn about the disability civil rights movement. It was called Awkward No More, talking about how to include disability as part of the civil rights movement. And so students in particular would research different civil rights movement and then discuss how it related to disability and in what ways disability was part of that movement. So it's all about, again, integrating disability into already existing trends.
And for people who are interested in learning more about your work, where should they go?
Yeah, they can go to the website, www.together2-international.org, and sign up for a campaign. Like I said, the one we're doing now is disability and entrepreneurship.
Diego, thanks again for joining me, and thank you for all the work you're doing.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. This was fun.